Hello and welcome to Faith Informed, an Engage International podcast where we seek to clarify truth claims, challenge prevailing ideologies, and commend the faith. In our culture today, it is increasingly difficult to have conversations on faith and God without being labeled as bigoted or intolerant. How do we have meaningful conversations with our non-Christian friends and family? How do we navigate through controversial topics? And that can be really hard. So how do we do it with poise and conviction? On today's podcast, we will think through some very important aspects of evangelism and learn how asking questions in an intentional, non-confrontational way helps to break down barriers and reach the heart. Joining me on the podcast today is Greg Koukl. Greg is the founder and president of Stand to Reason. He has spoken in over 80 college campuses and debated several atheists on national radio and television. He's also the author of several books, including The Story of Reality and Tactics. Thanks, Greg, for coming on the podcast today.
Sam, I'm glad to be here, and I like your introduction because it really does describe the challenge that we're facing. A very difficult culture that it's very hard to have meaningful conversations in. That's why I'm glad we're talking about tactics today. And actually, I have a new book that companions tactics called Street Smarts. I'm not sure if you've seen it or not, but it just came out a couple of months. You have seen. Okay, so I'm glad we're talking about this material because it's going to really help people make a difference.
Greg, the first time I heard you was on a debate you had with Deepak Chopra on Faith Under Fire with Lee Strobel.
Right.
Since then, I've grown to appreciate the work you do. Greg, you started out as someone who is skeptical of Christianity, and then you've spent the last 3 decades or so defending Christianity. So would you tell us your story? How did you become a Christian?
Yeah, actually, I spent the last 5 decades now. I just had my 50th spiritual birthday a couple of months ago, and most of that time really making the case that Christianity is actually true. And when I say true, I don't mean true and like true for me. I mean true like gravity is true. You know, I mean, if you stop believing in gravity, you're not going to float away. It's a feature of reality, right? So I was actually raised Roman Catholic, and when I was about 17 years old, I was asked a question, and the question was, do you really believe that? And I was actually in the middle of defending it when this gal said, do you really believe that? And I paused for a moment and I realized, no, I don't. And so I just walked away from it. And that was my exposure to Christianity. And so it wasn't so much that I was a skeptic of Christianity as I just didn't take it seriously anymore. It just wasn't on the table for me. Been there, done that kind of thing. And this was in the mid-'60s when the world was changing radically. What we see now is a result of what happened then. You sow to the wind and you reap the whirlwind is what the prophet said. And so all of the relativistic, sexual, libertarian views, libertine, I guess is what I mean more, views that are so, and narcissistic elements that are so inbred in our culture now really started wholesale in the 60s. And I embraced all that. It was fun. I was a young man, and I didn't want to think about purity and God and, that kind of thing. I had some spiritual ideas, but they were not worked through. They were just convenient, I guess I could have said at one point I'm spiritual but not religious. But basically, I just wanted to live for myself. But I was living somewhat in a contradiction in that I was a moral relativist, which means I'd abandoned the idea that there were true moral absolutes that ruled the world, that governed the world. That was nonsense. It was everybody had their own opinions. However, I was against the war in Vietnam at the time because, in my view, it was an immoral war. And there's the contradiction. On the one hand, I'm saying that there is no objective morality, and then on the other hand, I'm saying the war violates objective morality. So this was, a contradiction, though I was aware of, but I was willing to live with because of the payoff it was to me. And there's a lot of people today who'll say, "Hey, I'm okay with the contradiction." Well, they're only okay with the contradiction because it feeds a narcissistic desire, not because they're thoughtful and careful about the way they understand the world. Now, in my case, I had a high school sweetheart that I'd been going with for 5 years. I was at Michigan State University. She graduated, went to the West Coast, and so did I following her, and that relationship came to an end. And that wasn't the thing that brought me to the Lord, at least initially, but it did give me a wake-up call as to what I thought were substantive philosophies, what they actually gave me in life, which was they gave you almost nothing. They gave me nothing except for a false sense of freedom. And here I was not free anymore because I was going through deep emotional pain because of this broken relationship. Now, my brother Mark, there were 5 kids in our family, and my younger brother Mark had become a Christian during the Jesus movement, and he actually was on the West Coast at the same time, and we were in conversation, and he was always telling me about Jesus. And I actually, at first, like I said, I didn't take it seriously, and I would push back, and of course, I talked to Christians and had all kinds of questions that they weren't able to answer to my satisfaction. So I thought Christians were dumb. And I thought, well, my brother Mark, he's a jock, he needs that kind of thing. So, I'm the intelligent guy. I went to college, and and so I was kind of brushing him off. But I'll just tell you, in sum, basically, over the course of about a year, Mark's witness to me just ended up getting to me. God used that and little by little chipped away. And finally, I did pray a similar prayer that lots of people prayed. I was out in the field somewhere, and I just said, God, if you're real, then I want to know. And then a whole lot of things started happening in terms of the visibility of Christ, the gospel, and spiritual things. And in September 28, 1973, when Mark came to my apartment there in West LA while I was a student at UCLA, he began to tell me more about Jesus. And I said, Mark, you don't have to tell me anymore. I've already decided I want to become a Christian. And that was the night, a little more than 50 years ago, that I began following Christ, and I've been doing so ever since. And part of the thing, I got to add this, I mentioned I've been doing so ever since. It's not a pat on my back. I had great discipleship. I got involved in a Christian community very quickly. It was literally a Christian community. We all, like 70 of us, lived in the same house. Off the campus of UCLA, there was another 40 or 50 that lived off campus, and it was a kind of a school. And this is where I got discipled and got trained the first 2.5 years of my Christian life, and that really set the trajectory for me. That made all the difference in my life. And during that time is when I discovered apologetics. Wow. Because I wanted to have my own questions answered. Even though I was a Christian, I had questions, big ones, that weren't answered. And I wanted to be able to, answer the questions that others were putting to me as I talked to them on the street or wherever it happened to be that I had opportunity to share Christ. So that's what that was my spiritual birth, and almost a simultaneous birth of my interest in making the case for Christianity and defending Christianity as something genuinely, capital T, truth, or as Francis Schaeffer used to call it, true truth.
That's an incredible story, Greg. I just want to pick up on something you just said.
Sure.
So, it wasn't some argument for Christianity that brought you to faith in Christ. You heard the gospel over time, and you felt that this is true, or it spoke to you in a unique way, and you committed your life to Christ. And I think many of our listeners have a similar story of hearing the gospel and responding to it.
Right.
So some may wonder, then, what role does apologetics play in evangelism? You mentioned about how you saw the need for apologetics in answering questions, but some people are dismissive of the role of apologetics in evangelism because they say you can't argue people into the kingdom. We should just proclaim the gospel and trust the Holy Spirit to work in their hearts.
Well, in my case, I'm actually unique among my colleagues in what I do, in that apologetics did not play a significant role, or any role as far as I can remember, in my coming to Christ. But that's not the case with many of my colleagues. Frank Turek, J. Warner Wallace, John Noyes, who works for Stand to Reason, and a whole bunch of, at least Strobel. So, the fact is, and I talk about this in the early parts of the book Tactics, the role of arguments. And when people say you can't argue someone into the kingdom, only God can change a heart, that actually is a false dichotomy. and it's only half true. It is true that only God can change a heart, but God uses means to the ends of changing the heart. And the means isn't always the simple gospel, though in many cases that's it. People hear the simple gospel. But nowadays, it just seems that the role of apologetics is much more important as something God uses to help remove barriers to people and help them to see the plausibility of Christianity. From a human side, these are the kinds of things that God uses, all right? And so the fact is, when someone says you can't argue anybody to the kingdom, I say, nonsense. It happens all the time. And many of my colleagues, like I said, will tell you this is exactly how they became Christians. Famously, J. Warner Wallace, and he's the cold case detective that was an atheist, a very skilled detective, had four of his cases actually on TV, on what Dateline or whatever handles those detective cases, and he was called the evidence whisperer there because he was so good. And he never lost a case that went to trial. And this is cold cases. These are solving murders that were cold for 10, 15, 20 years. And he still got the bad guy. So he was good at that, but he was an atheist. And then he decided, when he was challenged that Jesus was the smartest man who ever lived, he decided to check it out and bought a $4 Bible at a thrift store, and then began to realize that as he's reading the Gospels, that these look like firsthand accounts of history, of events that happened. So he began to apply the tools of his trade to these accounts to see if they stood muster, which they did, and he became convinced that the Gospels were reliable, historical accounts, that Jesus rose from the dead, and he became a Christian. And then he became a Christian apologist, and then an author, a best-selling author, Cold Case Christianity. His first book, I think it was number 3 or number 4 on the bestseller list at Amazon in the evangelism category the other day. So it's doing very well. But see, there's a good example. And the other thing that I would say, not only is it not the case that people can't be argued into the kingdom. They can. God uses that. But it is something the Bible demands or commands, 1 Peter 3 famously, and that we should always be ready to give an answer for the hope that's within us. And when we look at Jesus and the disciples, they did this all the time. Ironically, when you read the end of the Gospel of John, chapter 20, I think, or maybe 21, John gives the reason that he wrote the Gospel. And he says many other signs and wonders Jesus performed that haven't been written in this book. Now, he's referring to Jesus' miracles, and there were lots of them, but there are only 7 recorded in the Gospel of John. But then John says, but these I've included in order that you would believe. Believe what? That Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and in believing have life in his name. So John says the whole reason for his gospel is that he wanted to give evidence that Jesus was who he claimed to be, so that people would then believe and receive eternal life. So how can you argue with that?
And if I remember right, you had some role to play in the life of J. Warner Wallace, right?
Yes, as it turns out. Yeah, I was kind of setting that up for a little bit later maybe, but it turns out I need to back up and just make a comment we can talk about later, but what I emphasize in my writings is not leading people to Christ, okay? And I think Christians have a faulty understanding of evangelism the way it's done now. The way it's done now is only about 150 years old.
Yeah.
But in the New Testament, there were no altar calls. There were no decisions to receive Christ in the sense that we talk about them. Pray to receive Christ as Lord and Savior. But rather, what was going on was not harvesting in that way. But the harvest was actually something that happened naturally as a result of good gardening, is my language. Jesus said in John 4, some sow and some reap. And when I'm making this particular point, I tell audiences that I actually haven't prayed with anyone to receive Christ in over 30 years, which shocks them, What a loser. But then I explain the concept of the importance of gardening, and then I mention that someone like J. Warner Wallace, who lots of people know. Anybody following apologetics in general can't miss Jim. And he is the absolute best apologetics presenter that I know, that I've ever seen. Okay. I know Jim well. We've known each other a long time. He worked for Stand to Reason for 2 years before we just couldn't hold him down because of the success of his book. And then he just took off with Cold Case. But Jim was in my garden before he was a Christian. And I didn't know this until later when he told me. And but in other words, there was a huge impact that I was personally having in his life while he was still an atheist, while I was gardening him. And then he later somehow became, I don't know the details of how he actually crossed the line. And by the way, some people don't know that. One of the people on our staff, John Noyes, was an atheist. He was in my garden also. And now he's a Christian, and he has no spiritual birthday that he can recall. And this happens with a lot of people. They come to an understanding and a confidence and a conviction, and they're trusting in Christ. And so somebody else went into my garden, and harvested my crop, but I don't care. Jesus said in John 4 that some sow and some reap, so the ones who sow and the ones who reap can rejoice together. So there are sowers and reapers, there are gardeners, and there are harvesters. And my conviction in this is, Sam, is that if we do the sowing properly, and what I call gardening, then the harvest is going to take care of itself. Because fruit that is ripe falls into the basket. You just bump on it. Like happened to me that night when my brother Mark came to my apartment there in 1973. And what happens to a lot of people. In fact, Sam, I take a poll now every time that I talk about this issue, tactics, or the new book Street Smarts, which it carries the tactics to the next stage, though it is a standalone book. You don't need tactics before you get Street Smarts, but they are connected kind of at the hip, so to speak. I take this poll. I first started taking it for my own curiosity. Now I take it for the sake of the audience. And what I do is I ask the audience, how many people here are Christian who did not become Christian by coming down for an altar call or praying with someone to receive Christ as Lord and Savior, which is kind of the standard evangelism motif. We have the booklets, the prayers in the end, and all that. Nothing wrong with that, either of those. But I just asked that question. And my average in an audience is 70% of the people raise their hands. 70. Wow. Sometimes it's lower, closer to 50. Sometimes it's almost 100. But what that means is the vast majority of people, even now, are coming to Christ without the aid of an evangelist that pushes them over the edge, so to speak, or gets them to sign on the dotted line or something to that effect. And now here's why this is important. This, of course, underscores the gardening aspect that I'm talking about, that the harvest comes in naturally by the Holy Spirit without somebody else doing the harvesting, all right? You go to an orchard, an apple orchard in October, right? This is apple harvest time or something like that, where the ripe apples are all on the ground. They fall right off when they're ripe, or they're very easy to pick, okay? Now, the reason this is important is that, Sam, is there are a lot of people, that are sitting on the bench, a lot of Christians that are sitting on the bench because they think that in order to evangelize effectively, they have to push someone towards a decision and hopefully get the decision. They pray the prayer, and then you have legitimized your witnessing event. How many people came to Christ? How often have we heard that? You have this rally, you have this event, you have this thing for non-Christians. How many people came to Christ? I think that's the wrong question to ask, because first we are measuring our effectiveness as ambassadors by a wrong standard. That is God's decision. God decides that. It's our job to be ambassadors, communicate the message clearly and faithfully, accurately, and graciously, And then it's God's worries about the rest. And apologetics plays a role in that. And sometimes there is no apologetics. Sometimes we're just communicating the gospel. Sometimes maybe the bad news to put things in perspective. Jesus did that often. Sometimes the bad news and the good news. Sometimes just the good news because people understand the bad news and they're under a weight of guilt. That's why Jesus said, "Come unto me, all who are weary and heavy laden." He's going to give the rest because he's the rescuer. Okay, and so if Christians are gain a biblical understanding, I'm thinking about the best way to phrase this, realize that in the New Testament there weren't any of these, there's not effort to get decisions, all right? And that kind of takes care of itself, that the effort should be in the gardening. Then if they're given gardening tools, which is what the tactics and street smarts material is meant to do, they're going to be more effective as gardeners. And it's going to be easier because they don't have the pressure of pushing. They are just going to have a more modest goal. And so here's the goal. Here's the way I describe the modest goal. And that is, I'm just trying to put a stone in people's shoe. Okay, I want to annoy them a little bit in a good way. I want to get them thinking. I want to say something that they can't just disregard, and that's the benchmark for my own conversations. And if I can just do a little bit here or a little bit there in different people's lives, I don't have to go the distance and try to pressure them to sign on the dotted line. The response I've been getting, Sam, from this for many years, now it's 14 years with the Book of Tactics, maybe 15 almost now, and Street Smarts has just been out for 3 months or 2 months. But nevertheless, the response I'm getting to people is that these tools have transformed their ability to engage in the kind of thoughtful and gracious way that you described at the opening of the show.
I really like the analogy that you used in the book. Your book has been a blessing to me personally as well, and I'll get into that in a little bit as well. So you mentioned John 4, and I think often we make the mistake of taking Jesus' words to the disciples in John 4, I sent you to reap what you have not worked for, to mean that all fields are ready for harvest.
That's right.
And we get disheartened because that just
Nothing
isn't our personal experience. And I think even in Matthew 9, when Jesus says the harvest is plentiful, we miss the context. There were large crowds thronging to hear Jesus who were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. They were eager to engage with Jesus. It is then that Jesus tells his disciples the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few.
Yeah. He was speaking in the present tense there and not universally. And even in Sychar there, the John 4 passage, you say there are 4 months and then come the harvest. I say, look in the fields, they are white for harvest. And I'm with you 100%, Sam. He was referring to Sychar. He wasn't saying every field is white with harvest, and this is clearly the case. And discouraging for a lot of people because I don't I think right now, I'm trying to weigh my words and make accurate assessments. The Holy Spirit is moving in powerful ways. There's no question in our culture, in our country, and other countries as well. But I'm speaking now for my own backyard, so to speak. Even so, the resistance, I think, the cultural resistance has never been stronger than it is right now, and sophisticated. Now, a lot of the so-called sophistication, what I'm referring to is rhetorical sophistication. They make their side sound so good and make us sound so bad. But the substance isn't there, you know. But nevertheless, we have to deal with the perceptions that are created by the rhetorical flourishes that people use against Christians. You know, like the word hate or phobe, how that's attached to everything that we hold to be dear. All these good things are called phobias. And hate, a strong, appropriate moral compass is called a vice right now, you know, and clever ways of characterizing that. So that's tough. We're up against that. There is a harvest to be had, and I know people are praying for revival. We're certainly not at it now. When I became a Christian, there was a revival. It was called the Jesus Movement. And many people have seen the movie The Jesus Revolution, and I actually haven't seen it because I lived it, you know. I was there, Southern California, Calvary Chapel, the whole deal. But I didn't know the principles involved, like Lonnie Stanley and Chuck Smith. But I mean, the very first church I ever went into as a brand new Christian, 2 weeks after I got saved, was Chuck Smith's Calvary Chapel, and I went to a concert there on a Friday night. So I mean, that was revival. The Holy Spirit was moving a lot. Something different is going on right now. There's a lot of hardship on Christians, and I think what's happening is the wind of persecution, such as it is blowing chaff away. And we can see that happening. And I think this is what the progressive church amounts to, the progressive Christian movement. This is the chaff being blown away. Why do I call it chaff? Because they're just like the world. Everything they believe, let me put it this way, nothing they believe is in leastwise offensive to any non-Christian because they hold all the same views. And then they try to put them on Jesus, which is, a mischaracterization. It's a libel, actually. So we're in a tough circumstance, and that's why having a tool, having a method, a way of engaging that keeps the Christian safe but allows the Christian to make a difference in the sense that they're able to communicate truth in a reasonable way to other people. Boy, that's really valuable now. And I think this is why many people have found the tactical approach and Street Smarts and the tactics books to be so helpful to them.
Speaking of progressive Christianity, I was reminded of a writer that I read a few years ago. He was comparing the church in the East and the church in the West. And he said the church in the West, not all churches, but a lot of the churches are accommodating to culture, and the church is declining. They think by accommodating to culture that the church will grow, but the church is declining. But the church in the East, having stood for orthodoxy, the church is growing. So that comparison was made. I can't remember the name of the author now when you just mentioned about it.
Right. Well, there's a new book out by Justin Brierley. He's late of the Unbelievable talk show there in London. And the book, I have it sitting over here. The title is something like The Amazing Rebirth of Belief in God, something to that effect. And what he's done in his exposure through his work with Unbelievable, talking to all of these incredibly intelligent atheists and movers and shakers in the secular world, he's seen a shift where a lot of these people are seeing how empty materialism is and the danger of wokeness. This is another big deal. The danger of wokeness, and now they're turning around. They're giving Christianity another look, and they're making common cause with Christians, sometimes against the left, because the left is so dangerous. But one of the things one of them said, and I'm trying to think of, I have to get my names right. There are two historians, British historians, I think, that
is it
he
Tom
mentions in his
Holland?
book. Yes, Tom Holland is one of them. And if you mention the other one, I'll probably get that. But Tom Holland's one of them. And one of these individuals, though, he said, be sure to make sure you keep Christianity weird. You want to keep Christianity weird. And then he goes on to explain what he has in mind. He says, too many Christians are trying to be like us in the secular world. They're trying to conform to us. And what we have is like, now we're realizing it's empty. Instead of saying we secularists ought to be conforming to them. And so this is the progressive movement is doing just that. Oh, please like us. We're just like you. We're not hateful, quote unquote, right? We're inclusive, and Jesus is wonderful. He loves everybody. He thinks all the sexualities are fine. Everything's great. He's pro-abortion. I mean, you see all these crazy things in these memes and these TikToks and stuff like that. And there are people out there that want something different. And what they want actually is the truth, but it just shows how important it is, even from a certain sense, strategic perspective. I mean, set aside the faithfulness element right now, which is really the most important, faithfulness to God. But the strategic element, people don't want us to be just like them. They're going to be persuaded by an appeal to the hard road of walking with Christ in truth. And so anyway, that's interesting what's happening in culture.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. That's helpful. Now, I'd like to talk to you about one of the main tactics you advocate for in your book, the Columbo tactic.
Yes.
I really like the names you have given these tactics. When I first came across the Columbo tactic in your book, I thought you were a missionary kid who grew up in Colombo, the capital of Sri Lanka.
And, spelled differently, actually. Right.
This tactic must have something to do with it.
Yeah.
So tell us the real backstory and what the Columbo tactic is. I know there are 3 steps involved. Tell us what's the first step in the Columbo tactic.
Well, the I mentioned the book Tactics is subtitled A Game Plan for Discussing Your Christian Convictions. And there are lots of different tactics. These are maneuvers and conversations that are helpful. But the Columbo tactic is the game plan itself that the others serve. And Lieutenant Columbo is a murder detective on TV, the number one most recognizable TV icon of all time, as it turns out. But a lot of people don't know who he is because they don't watch TV like that anymore. You can get him on YouTube or whatever. But what was interesting about Columbo was his manner. He would come in very, very disheveled and disorganized. He never had a pencil. He had to bum a pencil off of somebody so he could write and take notes. And he had a cigar, scratching his head all the time. He seemed pretty harmless. And so the person who's the murderer, who is part of the whole scene from the beginning of this particular way of doing murder mysteries, never took him seriously. They weren't concerned about it. They were so much smarter than stupid Columbo. So he'd come under the radar and be unassuming and start asking questions. And they were innocent at first, but then he'd be more direct and started asking questions, not just to gather information, but he's got an idea of who's the bad guy. And of course, as a viewer, you know who it is. And he's slowly probing and maneuvering to get into the final kind of what we would call now the mic drop moment, but he was using questions all the time, okay? And because he was using questions and because his manner was unassuming and non-aggressive and almost apologetic, he did not seem to be a threat. So people's guard wasn't up. And so this is what I'm trying to capture by using the term Columbo, to describe the game plan itself, which, as you mentioned, has 3 steps. And the very first step is for us to do what Columbo did as the very first step. And when I say first step, I want people to think, don't worry about leading anybody to Christ. Don't even worry about getting to the gospel. Don't worry about any of that. All you want to do first is gather information. So that's the first step. And I give a model question. What do you mean by that? Now, that's just a model question. There's lots of variations. Somebody might say, well, the Bible's been changed. Really? Tell me about it. How do you think it's been changed? What does that look like? So that's a what do you mean by question. I have in the book a conversation with a witch in Wisconsin, and she's wearing a pentagram, a 5-pointed star around her neck, and this is often an occultic symbol. And so I asked her, does that jewelry have any religious significance? And she said, yes, it does. I'm a pagan, is what she said. Turned out she was a witch. I asked her, as she's describing it, I said, are you Wicca? And she said, yes, I am Wicca. So this then led to a longer conversation. But notice I'm just drawing her out, getting information. And this is especially important when people ask questions that may turn out to be more loaded than many think. So I'll trick audiences in a church when I get to this point and talk about the importance of asking, what do you mean by that? Questions, gathering as much information as you can before you move to the next step. You want to get the lay of the land. You want to get intel. And then I say, by the way, does this church take the Bible literally? And, oh, yeah. Everybody goes, yeah. And I said, in other words, do you think Jesus is a stick? What do you mean? Well, he said, I am the vine and you are the branches. Oh, you're all sticks.
Or a door.
Yeah, or a door, right. And now they're all quizzical, like, what's he getting at? I said, you made a mistake here. What should you have asked me when I asked you, do you take the Bible literally? Of course, the proper answer is, well, what do you mean by that? Because it does depend. And in Street Smarts, I do talk about that problem of so-called taking the Bible literally. We want to take the Bible with the degree of exactness or whatever, basically the intention of the author, with the precision that the author intended. And so metaphors, we take as metaphors, and other straightforward things we take as straightforward. So they should have asked, well, what do you mean by literal? Or if you say, do you believe in evolution? Don't just say no. Say, what do you mean by evolution? Because there's lots of different kinds. I believe in some kinds of evolution. My theology has evolved over time, But anyway, it's the Darwinian project, the molecules to man thing, that I reject as unsound scientifically. So these are where these questions are really, really important. And I want Christians to get in the habit of asking that first question as much as they possibly can. In fact, if you ever get in a tight spot, you always ask a question. It tosses the ball in the other person's court. It shows an interest in their view. It gives you a breather. It gives you some thinking opportunity, and you're going to get some information, hopefully, that you might be able to use. You certainly aren't putting anything on the line when you ask a question, so there's no risk to the Christian at all. Basically, the rule is the burden of proof is on the person who makes the claim. So if you say, well, God exists, or Jesus is the Savior, or Jesus rose from the dead, or the Bible is God's Word, or anything you might say as a Christian, now you've made a claim. Now you've got to back it up. But if you don't make claims, you don't have anything you have to back up if you ask questions instead. Now, we're going to see, especially with the Street Smarts book, how it's possible to actually make powerful points by using questions and not by making statements. And as long as you're not making statements, you're off the hook. You're, as I say often, you're ankle deep in the shallow end of the pool. All right. This is why the Street Smarts book is subtitled "Using Questions to Answer Christianity's Toughest Challenges."
Great. So the first step is asking questions to gather information. I think this is very important. It's important that we understand the other person's views so we know how to respond, or else we might be answering objections they themselves may not have, right?
That's right. Or misrepresenting their view, which we don't want to do. That's a straw man.
Greg, I remember the first few years doing apologetics ministry right after graduating from Talbot. I was so excited to share the answers I found with people that as soon as someone asked a question or raised an objection, I wasted no time. I was ready with my response. I would give them reasons for why they are wrong, and so often my conversations would quickly turn into a contest.
Yeah.
It was after reading your book that I realized the importance of asking questions, because asking questions communicates love and concern for the other person, right? And there is none better than Jesus at asking questions.
Right.
Because in the Gospels, Jesus, I think, asked more than 300 questions or so.
Yeah, something like that, right. I have a footnote on it. I have to check it myself, but it was a lot, hundreds.
Yeah, I remember reading it somewhere that Jesus answered only 3 questions directly, and the rest of them were like he answered questions with a question. I could be wrong on that number. And this spoke powerfully to his audience and conveyed the message that he was deeply interested in them. So after asking, what do you mean by that, or some clarifying question of that sort, of that kind, what's the next step in the Columbo tactic?
Okay, actually the next step is somewhat similar to the first, because in the first place you're gathering information, specifically more detail about their view or their challenge that they've offered. In the next step, you're gathering a different type of information. First, you're getting their view. Secondly, you want to find out why they believe their view is true. Okay? So some form of the question, well, how did you come to that conclusion, or why do you think that's the case, or why do you think that's the way it happened? Take the Bible's been changed. Okay, well, what do you mean it's been changed? They explain how they think it's, in a telephone game or whatever, and from one generation to the other it gets changed. Okay, now I understand the concept. Now, why do you think that's actually what took place? Now, that's a separate issue. And so now I'm asking another question. I'm asking for the justification of the view they just gave. And what's interesting about that is it actually in both cases, they're very simple questions, very easy to ask, and they're fair. With someone offering a challenge or offering an opposing point of view, they're entirely fair to ask, get clarification, and then find the reasons, all right? Reversing the burden of proof is what I call the second step. But what's amazing to me, and maybe you've experienced this too, Sam, is that lots of times when I ask people to either clarify their view, first step, or to give reasons for their view, second step, I get dead air.
Yeah.
I get, the sounds of silence, like the Simon and Garfunkel song.
I don't expect that question.
They don't expect it, and they actually have not really thought about it. They don't expect it, and they can't answer it. If they had a clear take on their view, and they had a clear understanding of why their view was sound, then they would be able to give that, even if caught by surprise by the question. But they just don't have that, and this is a consistent experience that I have with people. They just don't know their own views. And so notice that in the first two questions, all you need to know basically is what your objective is and the model question. And I've given both. Gather information. What do you mean by that? Reverse the burden of proof. How did you come to that conclusion? Oh, that's simple. You could be a one-day-old Christian. No theology, no apologetics, no philosophy. You just, at that stage, you're being a student of other people's views. But you'll be amazed at how, and I give illustrations of this in Street Smarts, be amazed at how just those two questions can get a person thinking profoundly regarding their own view and the adequacy of it. I've seen it happen time and time again. I had a waitress in Seattle once. Look, I have to tell you, I'm not a morning person. So when I'm pulling my roller bag out of the hotel into the cafe on my way to preach at a church on Sunday morning. I'd worked Friday night and all day Saturday in Seattle. I was tired. I didn't want to talk to anybody. But she was very talkative. And so she started telling me about, I told her, she asked me what I was doing. I'm going to go preach in a church. I thought I'd get rid of her. And she said, well, that's great. I'm thinking, why would she think that's great? So I asked her, are you a Christian? She said, no. I used to be a Christian, but now the universe takes care of me. That's what she said. And I'm thinking, huh? What does that mean? So I asked her, how does the universe take care of you? Is the universe a person? She says, no. Well, how can it take care of you? She pauses for a moment. She says, well, I guess God takes care of me. Oh, okay. That makes sense. And God is the universe. I said, what do you mean that God is the universe? How could God be the universe? So now keep in mind, I do not want to witness to this girl. I don't want to talk at all to anyone about anything. Certainly not about Jesus or God. It's too early, right? But I couldn't help myself. She's saying these things that's so ambiguous to me. My inner Columbo is coming out, right? And so I'm asking just these clarification questions, but I'm not getting a sensible answer. And there were a couple more questions, and I never got anything clear from her. And finally, she walked away, and I didn't have any sense, Sam, that anything that I had questioned her on had made any difference in her confidence in the kind of new agey view that she had now that she traded Christianity for. She just was full of confidence. But when she brought the bill, she said, nobody has ever asked me questions about my view before. And it got me thinking. Wow, there's a stone in her shoe. And I wasn't even trying. And that was just the first step. Okay. I told her, well, if I had more time, I could ask you more questions and you could do more thinking. Kind of jokingly said that. And I left some material behind for her to read. But notice this is the power of the game plan. That was merely step one, and I didn't even want to do it. Yet God still used that in her life. And I hope that gives your listeners a bit of an understanding of how powerful this can be if they begin to practice it. But incidentally, I often say this at the end of my talks. Here's a basic rule in life. If you don't do it, it don't work. All right? So you got to do it.
Yeah.
But it's not hard. So that's the second step. You're going to ask questions to find out the rationale and the reasons for their view.
So in the second step, we are asking questions to find out how they arrived at that conclusion, or why do they believe what they believe.
Right.
And as you were sharing the particular story of the lady in Seattle, I was reminded of this instance in Mark 10, Jesus' response to the rich man who addressed him as good teacher. And Jesus in turn asked him, why do you call me good?
Right.
So now tell us the last step in the Columbo tactic.
Okay. So the first steps are easy, and anyone can do those because they don't require anything but knowing the step. And you are essentially a student of somebody else's view. And as I pointed out, even those two steps, which are somewhat passive, can be powerful in having an influence on a person. However, the third step is where we're actually taking the initiative to use our questions to make a point. That's the step. Use our questions to make a point. All right. And the point what I really explore heavily in the Street Smarts book is the point that we're making is we're trying to parry a challenge that someone has offered to us, or we're trying to show a weakness or a flaw in the other person's view. Okay, and so what we're going to do we're going to use questions to do that. But now this is more advanced, because if we're going to parry something or show a flaw, then we're going to have to know what the flaw is or know how to parry that shot at Christianity. So there's knowledge that's required here. And this is where general apologetics come in. And this kind of takes us back to your earlier remark, Sam, about when you got out of Talbot and you were loaded for bear, so to speak. Yeah. Well, that's good to have that information because now you know what's wrong. Now it's the delivery system that we're concerned about, all right? So what we can do is we can go and preach that at people, essentially saying you're wrong because of A, B, C, D, and E. And by the way, that God still uses that, but it's not the most shrewd way of approaching things. And I think that it's better if we can find a way to use questions to expose the problem. All right, and probably in the book, by the way, Street Smarts now, because this is where I'm taking the third step of the tactical game plan in the tactics book, and now I'm addressing all of these issues. I have 2 chapters on atheism. I have a chapter on the problem of evil. I have a chapter on can we be good without God, because that's also in play here with atheists, the moral issue. I have 2 chapters on Jesus. I have 2 chapters in the Bible, slavery and genocide on the one hand, and then the Bible and science and how these work together. And I have 2 chapters on abortion. I have a chapter on sex and gender and marriage. So I'm trying to cover all of the controversial bases, things that people run into, and I provide the backstory. The atheist has a multitude of objections, who created God? There is no evidence for God. Atheism is the only rational choice, and et cetera, et cetera. And you see the same thing with lots of these other issues. So what I do is I show on these individual challenges where they fall short. Here's the problem. Okay, now you got the information. Now what? We're going to use questions. And so what I offer then are dialogues with the proper questions that are meant to lead out and bring the person along to the point where you might call it a mic drop moment, where you reveal where your questions have now led your friend in conversation. Let me give you an illustration. It's probably easiest. Atheists frequently say, well, there's no evidence for God. In fact, they say this all the time. There's no evidence. There's just no evidence. So when someone says that to me, and I've had this conversation a number of times, and this conversation is actually in the Street Smarts book, I say, do you mind if I ask you a few questions? No, go ahead. Okay, so I ask for permission, very congenial. First couple of questions are pretty simple. Then the other ones are most important. So here's the first question. Do you believe or do you think that things exist? Pretty easy, right? Sure. Okay, so do I. Right. Okay, now here's another one. The things that exist, have they always existed? Or is the universe eternal? Now, there's nobody who believes that the universe always existed, which is interesting because both Christians and non-Christians believe the same thing. In this case, that the universe had a beginning. They call it the Big Bang, and some Christians don't like that, but I don't want them to worry about that. It's not relevant. All we're doing right now is trading on the common agreement that the universe came into existence. All right? Great. Okay, I agree with you on that second point. Here's the third question. This is the one that really matters. What caused the universe to come into existence? I'll make it easy on you. You only have 2 choices. Something or no thing. Something or nothing. The universe was caused by something outside of the universe, or the universe just popped into existence without a cause. Now you tell me what you think. Now that's the question. Now, of course, here's the hard part for the atheist at this point, Sam. Because he doesn't want to say something outside of the universe is the cause of the universe, because all they believe is that the material universe is all that exists. Okay. But what are they left with? The universe, it can't even be self-caused because it has to exist to cause itself. If it's self-caused, that's nonsense. It's just got to just pop into existence out of nothing. And this is just like, really, that's worse than magic. With magic, you got a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat, right? But now you got no magician. And you got no hat. You just got a rabbit, right? That's what they're stuck with. Now, I'm not trying at this point to prove God exists. What I'm trying to demonstrate is that he's the odds-on favorite. So I'm giving evidence for God. You said there's no evidence. Here's evidence. And the idea is if we've got an effect, which the universe coming into existence is an example of, then something needed to cause it. That's our universal common experience, all right? So why would you want to opt for nothing caused it? Okay, you're welcome to that. But don't pretend like it's the odds-on favorite, really. So and so that's my point. I'm just trying to put a stone in their shoe is the way I put it. I just want to get them thinking. I'm just lowering the bar for myself. I don't have to take it any further unless he wants to talk further. But there's no way out for him on this one. He's got to affirm something that is wildly counterintuitive, all right? And I want you to notice something else, Sam, that's really important about the street smarts approach, and it's characteristic of all the dialogues. What I could have done is I could have given that argument piece by piece, just extemporaneously. Okay, so things exist, and they didn't always exist. They must have come into existence. Therefore, there had to be a cause of their existence, etc. And some of your listeners, and I know you recognize this, I recognize this as a cosmological argument, right? In particular, the Kalam cosmological argument, a favorite of William Lane Craig. So you don't need to know all that philosophy, though. I just did it in a simple way, okay? And what I did, though, instead of laying that argument out and inviting objections and resistance at every point that I try to do that, if I had just go off with the argument, maybe your style before you read the books, you learned this stuff, okay, here it is. And mine, too, I get that entirely. My discipler called me the what did he call me? The answer boy or something like that, the question kid or something, because I was always trying to answer all the questions, In any event, instead of me doing that, I was enlisting the other person as an ally in the process of showing the flaw. Because for each step, I would ask a question that would give a common sense response, and that's a piece on the table that he put there, not me. And if he put the piece on the table that leads to my conclusion, he's not going to take it off very easily because he put it there in response to my question. And this is where I'm going in, the quiz kid. That's what he called me. Craig used to call me the quiz kid. Okay, it just dropped, the change dropped into the meter there on that. This is one of the most powerful elements of the street smarts approach, is that we're actually getting the other person to help us. And notice it's completely dialogical. It's back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And all I'm asking for in some cases is clarification of their view. And okay, so you said the pro-choice person says, a woman, it's my body and I can do whatever I want with my own body. Oh, really? I'm curious how that works. Tell me a little bit more about it. I have autonomy. I have a say-so. I'm not telling you what to do with your body. If I want to do something with my body, I can do it. Okay. Well, do you mind if I ask you a question? No, go ahead. If you had a 2-year-old at home and you were tired of taking care of her and you wanted to have a weekend in the Bahamas, could you just put out some cereal for her and then go to the Bahamas for a week? Because you can do whatever you want with your own body? No, I wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
Well, why not? Well, because she needs me.
Yeah.
She cares for me. Oh, so, okay, thanks for the clarification. So in other words, it's not entirely strictly true. You can do anything you want with your own body. Sometimes there are limitations. Yes, that's right. Notice all I'm doing is affirming what I'm getting her to acknowledge is the case. Now the situation is, what are the circumstances in which it's okay for us to tell somebody else what they can do with their body? And she's just identified one. She has a 2-year-old that's dependent upon her, right? So there's another case, back and forth, back and forth. I'm going somewhere with this. I'm asking questions that are common sense, that give a legitimate, reasonable response, and then now I know, because I'm intentional about the questions I'm asking, I know where I'm going to use it against her false view. Because the fact is, nobody can do whatever they want with their own body, not in a civilized country at least. And so anyway, that's where I'm going with that. And by the way, that dialogue is also in the Street Smarts book. So that gives you an idea how this third step can play out.
And I think the challenge is learning how to use questions to make a point.
That's right.
And you gave us a number of examples here as well. Now,
it's a learned process, though. And I don't want people to be intimidated. The book is there to help walk you through the steps, and just take it at your own speed.
Now, some of the questions people ask stem from personal experiences. I once had a mother of a severely disabled child ask me, if God is so good, why does he allow this in my child's life? Now, notice it's not a question in the abstract,
Right.
if God exists, why is there so much pain and suffering in the world?
Right.
But it's a very personal question. How do we respond to such questions, especially when the question emerges out of a personal experience? Do you have a Columbo-style response to something like that?
Well, I do, and but this is something that where we want to be careful, so people are convinced we have a heart when we're engaging. And sometimes, left brain folk like me, and probably like you, and a lot of apologists, we want to get to the issue and give the answer and all that. And sometimes there's a broken, wounded heart. That's right there in front of us, and it's important for us to respond in that way. And sometimes there's questions that can be asked, and other times it's just assurances that are given, And the fact is, when people ask the question, why did God do this, or why didn't God do that? Those are questions that there are no answers to, because God hasn't told us why. They go to God's intention. But when it comes to this thing, how could a good God allow something like this to happen? I have an illustration I give in the books, but I put it in the form of a question. Did you ever take your children to the doctor to get shots? Yes. Do your children like shots? No. Mine don't like shots. But you force them to suffer through the shots. Do you love your kids? Yes, of course. Are you good? Yes. Was giving them the shot a good thing? Yes, but they didn't like it. Yes. Okay. So this helps us. I would explain now. Now I'm kind of narrating for the person what I'm doing. This helps us to understand that sometimes things that may feel bad or seem bad to us in our subjective experience, there could be a greater good that comes out of it. There could be a greater good that comes out of it. All right? So I want to at least introduce that idea as a plausible option to a person who's struggling like this. And then maybe just some testimony would be forthcoming. In my case, I would offer, not so much directly from my life, because I haven't had that circumstance, but I know people who have had that. These people are the most marvelous people I know. These are Christian people who have special needs kids. They treat their children as valuable, made in the image of God, and the trial and hardship that they have to endure because of the special needs child transforms them into virtuous people. And many will say that. You see the care and love they give to their kids. And how it's not, to them it's not just a burden like, oh, rats. I mean, it is a burden, obviously, but they realize there's something greater. And in fact, as Christians, this is a very important lesson for us to learn. And I don't know how much of this I would share with the woman who's struggling with that, but if she was a Christian, I certainly would say this. The hardships that God allows in our lives are gifts by God to us to do something for us in our lives that would never be able to be accomplished by God otherwise. And anybody who's been around the block with God for a few times and walking seriously with him know exactly what I'm talking about. It's the hardest things in life that we endure that are the sharpest surgical instruments for God to accomplish his purpose. Paul makes this very clear, by the way. He says in 2 Corinthians 4, he says, for momentary light affliction. And by the way, when you think about Paul's life, it didn't seem light. Whipped 5 times, 39 lashes, beaten with rods, 3 times, shipwrecked, the whole deal. It's all there in 2 Corinthians. And it didn't seem momentary. His whole life was that. But he was looking at a longer perspective. And what he says there is momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory. So I think the proper way to answer is to sympathize with people and then help them to understand that sometimes it's the hardships in our lives that are the most important things for us and do the most important work in our lives. And at least if they're not Christian, at least they can see that in principle. It might be that God is very, very good, even though he allows for a time a lot of awful things to happen. All right. And by the way, if there is no God, what's the alternative? I remember Bertrand Russell saying, I didn't hear him say this, but it's a famous quote. Bertrand Russell, the great 20th century philosopher, a British atheist. And he said, how is the Christian? How are you going to talk about God when you're kneeling at the bed of a dying child? Oh, that's hard. This is your issue, Sam, that you've raised. But then William Lane Craig, the Christian philosopher, says, well, what is the atheist Russell going to say? Bertrand Russell. What is the atheist Bertrand Russell going to say when he's kneeling at the bed of a dying child? Tough luck? Too bad? That's the way it goes? He's got nothing to say because there's nothing to say. It's all loss. It isn't even a tragedy if you think of tragedy in moral terms. It's just a hardship. It's descriptively a hardship. But there's no morality to judge the badness of that event. The Christian has a lot to say. He can talk about the power of God and the love of God and the eventual state of affairs that God will bring about when the world will be made right once humans who caused the problem are rescued by him. And then he'll make it right. So, that's a tough issue. There's no question about that. And some are tougher than others. That's one of the toughest. But there's a way to approach it if you have some understanding about things. And we always want to be kind and gracious in the process, knowing that there is a human being that's suffering that we're talking to.
That's a great answer, Greg. It's a very challenging situation. When I was battling cancer, I'm a cancer survivor. When I was battling cancer...
Congratulations.
Thank you. Towards the end of my treatment, I was having this conversation with one of my professors at Talbot, and he asked me this question, Sam, how do you feel? How are things going with you? So I told him, if God had to allow this to teach me the lessons that I learned through it, I don't mind. Right. It is hard, and it was hard. And I think it was that year or the following year during Thanksgiving when we were just sharing what are we thankful for. I remember saying I'm most thankful for prayers that God did not answer the way I wanted him to answer. So yeah, you hit the nail on the coffin right there. And thanks so much, Greg, for that response.
That takes, to receive an answer like that, though, takes some maturity and sophisticated thinking, which, people in the world characteristically are not able to do or patient for because there's so much narcissism. Pain is sin in their mind. Pleasure is virtue in their mind. And if God brings pain, if we are claiming that our God is a God who allows pain, then our God is not a good God, period. That's it. But I think the question, what's the alternative, is a real important one, because if you get rid of God, then what do you have is just molecules in motion. You still have all the same misery that you have. There's just no possibility of redemption. So even in that regard, when you compare the alternative, I think that's a very fair question to ask lots of times. Okay, what's the alternative? There's got to always be something else. If you leave one thing, there's got to be something else. If you deny God for this reason, understandably, then that means what you're left with is no God. And now you have just molecules in motion, and you're all alone, and that's it. This isn't even a tragedy in a moral sense, because you can't say this isn't the way it's supposed to be, because there is no way in atheism it's supposed to be. So that comparison, I think, is helpful, and that's one comparison I make actually in the book Street Smarts.
Great. I think I could be wrong here. It was Carl Sagan who said we are molecular machines, right? And when he died, I could be wrong, but I remember reading that his wife said a molecular machine has broken down or something. I don't know.
Yeah, well, certainly that concept. I don't know if Carl Sagan said that, but there was. He certainly said other things, and like the cosmos is all there is, or ever was, or ever will be. So, I don't think he tried to say he wasn't an atheist because he didn't know there was no God, but certainly he believed there was no God. Otherwise, he wouldn't have made that claim about the cosmos. But that's what it amounts to. We're wet machines, and if once we're stardust, as some people have put it, and that's it. I mean, obviously, our physical bodies are made of stardust, of ancient stardust, but nevertheless, there's more to us than just our physical bodies, and the more to us is what really matters. It's the invisible self that's called the soul that bears God's image and makes all the difference.
Great. So sometimes we find ourselves being cornered as this tactic is used against us, right? So we were talking about how to use the Columbo tactic, the third step in the tactic, to make a point. So how do we navigate conversations in which the Columbo tactic is used against us?
Well, if somebody is using the first two steps, there's no trouble at all. There ought not be. If they're asking, what do I mean, or why do I believe it, those are questions that Christians ought to be capable of responding to. All right? We ought to be clear on what we mean. We're often not. And so we need to, get more clear on our own theology, our own convictions, and the reasons for it. But this third category is where we could run into trouble, because sometimes the atheist is asking us questions and asking us to affirm certain things, and we're not quite sure what our affirmations are going to lead to, at least in his mind. Now, there is actually a book. Peter Boghossian wrote a book. Peter Boghossian, fairly well-known atheist, former professor over at Portland State. And not anymore. He resigned because of all the wokeness, and now he is actually making common cause with people like Corey Miller or Ratio Christi, debating on the same side against the left. But he did write a book called A Manual for Creating Atheists, and he teaches the exact same thing to atheists as a way of upending theists, Christians in particular. And he uses questions, but I don't think he always uses them in a fair way. And so sometimes they're manipulative. This is not our goal. It's to lead people down in a fair and accurate way to a conclusion. So if a Christian thinks that they're being maybe maneuvered a little bit with the questions, you can just refuse to play the game, as it were. You could just simply say, it sounds to me like you're asking a lot of questions to make a particular point. How about if you just do this? Just make your point. Tell me your reasons, your rationale, where you go to, and let me think about it. So we just take it right out of that dynamic. We step out of it entirely. Now, when I've recommended this, and this details in the tactics book, I've recommended this. People said, well, what happens if you're using tactics and they do the same thing to you? I said, well, then I'll follow their lead, and I'll just make my point. My tactical edge will have been taken away from me. All right? But I can still tell my view and my reason for it, and then see what they respond to. So, but I've never had that happen to me, actually. I have had a circumstances where I said, well, why don't you just you're asking a bunch of questions here, and I'm not sure where these are going. But you know where they're going, so why don't we just go there? Tell me what your point is, and be clear, and tell me why, and then let me think about it. Let me respond to it. I'm not offended. I'm not bugged or anything. I'm just holding my ground, and I'm not going to follow their lead with the questions and down the primrose path, so to speak, to my own destruction. But I think Boghossian does do that in an illicit way in his book. Indeed, in Street Smarts, I talk about Peter Boghossian and that book, and I talk about some of the problems.
Thank you for joining us on today's episode of Faith Informed. In the next episode, we will continue this conversation with Greg Koukl on how to navigate through difficult conversations with poise and conviction. If you enjoyed today's episode of Faith Informed, please like, share, and subscribe. If you're listening on any of the podcast platforms out there, please leave a review. I look forward to seeing you next time, right here on Faith Informed.